Well, it's happening because of the current dreadful situation of international terrorism, which we believe is being sponsored by several states. Saudi Arabia, some of the Gulf states, Pakistan, are, we believe, training and financing Islamic fundamentalist and terrorist organizations. And we think that the world needs to be made aware and needs to confront the actual issues rather than pander to the wealth of Saudi Arabia or the strategic positioning of Pakistan.
Thank you.
So therefore, this is a seminar devoted to examining Pakistan's role in promoting terrorism while at the same time suffering the effects of it.
A little bit of white Christmas or something like that and cold. This time around September, definitely, you know, cricket season khatam ho jata hai. Cricket season khatam ho jata hai. So kind of. कह रहे हैं under 20 years का record. हाँ नहीं last. We can see that. Obviously, की बात होगी कि flights
Yes, my name is William Crawley. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, based here in the University of London. And we are here in the Senate House room of the University of London.
Sir, what a marvelous seminar here today taking place. Can you share your thoughts about it and the importance of it?
Well, it's important. It's a very hot afternoon, and I am sure people will be being brought here because of the importance of the topic, which is a question, really. Is Pakistan the perpetrator or victim of terrorism? I think the answer for most of the speakers, and we have 5 distinguished speakers, will be that it is both, for reasons that will vary across a wide spectrum of argument.
And why do you think events like this are important for our society at large?
Well, because this is a current situation. I mean, a lot of books have been written about Pakistan. One almost comes out every month, which shed light on aspects of the very difficult situation that they faced over the past 15 years. And different interpretations of it. It's very important to us in Europe, in Britain, where acts of terrorism have either been committed or anticipated, and it has had an effect on the Muslim and Pakistani communities in Europe, in Britain, and in the United States, which has not always been something to welcome.
Yeah.
The abuse will soon follow.
My head that
you come
sit there somewhere.
Prashad's name on it?
Yeah. Doesn't matter.
Skype.
Well, you're not in the beam.
Are you sure?
Sit here for the time. My name is William Crawley. I'm from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, based here in this building. And welcome to you all this very hot, I perhaps should call it a Pakistani summer afternoon, if it were not for the fact that the Indian summer is usually attributed to the Native American Indians rather than other Indians. So not appropriate, but a very hot afternoon. I hope we won't. I hope we will survive it. I'm really grateful to you all for coming. This seminar is sponsored jointly by the Democracy Forum in a process of continued collaboration with the Henry Jackson Society. The Democracy Forum and its associated monthly news journal, Asian Affairs, has held a number of seminars on issues of insurgency and terrorism in South Asia. The Henry Jackson Society was founded in Cambridge University in 2005 and named after the late US Democratic Senator Jackson, in his day an influential internationalist. In 2009, the Henry Jackson Society became the secretariat of two all-party parliamentary groups for transatlantic and international security, based in the House of Commons. It may be described as an activist research organization, has a record of supporting interventionism in defense of democratic freedoms, quite a controversial policy. Earlier this afternoon, I think I'm right in saying, it launched a new report at the House of Commons on Europe's Islamist terror networks. Is that right?
I wasn't there.
You weren't there. One of our speakers, Kyle Orton, is a research fellow with the Henry Jackson Society, and he'll be speaking to us later. The topic on which we're going to focus at this seminar is put as a question. Is Pakistan a victim or perpetrator of terrorism? The question mark is important and features in the titles chosen by several of our speakers. I think it's fair to say that for most of them, the short answer to the question will be both. There can be little dispute that Pakistan has suffered tremendous loss of life, both of civilian and military, as a result of acts of terrorism. The other element of the title that I'd like to emphasize is that it is Pakistan rather than Pakistanis that is the subject of the question. Acts of terror have certainly been committed by Pakistanis, just as they have by Saudis. Look at 9/11. But the involvement of state institutions in both cases is a more complex issue, which our speakers will surely help to clarify. Now, we have 5 distinguished speakers, all of them familiar with South Asia and experts in their field. We will allow a short time for questions after each 15-minute presentation and keep a longer space for general discussion at the end. Christine Fair, who is due to address us first, unfortunately was unable to get here from Washington, but she is, we hope, online, and we will try and connect her now. Christine Fair, I'm William Crawley. I've just done a short introduction to this seminar. I know you're a very familiar guest and very nice to see you back. I'm sorry you're not here in person. There were people who were keen to meet you as well as to hear from you. I was just explaining that we have 5 speakers, all of them familiar with South Asia and, like yourself, experts in their field. We'll allow a short time for questions after each 15-minute presentation. I don't know how long you're able to stay with us on Skype, but after your presentation, I hope you'll be able to take some questions. And there will be time for a longer time for general discussion at the end. Before I ask you to speak, I'm going to introduce you. Dr. Christine Fair is an associate professor at the Center for Peace and Security Studies and Security Studies program within Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She was previously a senior political scientist in the RAND Corporation and a political officer with the UN Assistance Minister in Afghanistan, Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. And she was a senior research associate with the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention at the US Institute of Peace. She is the author of a recent study of the Pakistan Army, published in 2014, with the title Fighting to the End, the Pakistan's Way of War. This is it. I looked it out, especially when you heard you might not be coming. I thought I'd have to deliver a paper on your behalf, based on your book. The book is a carefully researched and forcefully argued work it contains a section called, with a question mark, Pakistani support for the militants, which is especially relevant to at least one half of the topic, the subject in which he is going to speak to us. She'll be speaking to us on Skype, and she'll be able to take questions on Skype. In her book, she explores, and particularly that section that I've referred to, she explores the connection between Pakistan's nuclear policies, the development of its nuclear capacity, and Pakistan's relationship with proxy organizations and other activist organizations, militant organizations, which have been operating in India. Dr. Fair, welcome. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you. So do you have the slides available?
I haven't been told about that.
Oh, that's important. I had
Okay.
sent along some slides. All right, so let's go to the first slide. Well, let me just give you a very brief overview. First of all, I apologize that I'm not with you. I've never missed a flight. I've been sick in Delhi, and I missed this flight. So I'm terribly sorry, and I'm very grateful that you guys have managed to work this out. So what I'm going to be doing is presenting a series of maps based upon a data set that I was able to put together with my collaborators, Jacob Shapiro and Ethan Bueno de Mosquita. And I think the maps are really important because it shows you significant trends in the kinds of violence that Pakistan has experienced. So if we can go to the first slide, simply gives you the source of where you can get these data, and they're on my website. So if we can go then to the third slide, which is a table. What I've done here, it just gives you a very quick overview. I've divided up our data set into two time frames. One is before 2001 and one is after. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is that while it's true that there has been more violence after 2001, it's also the case that there was a lot of violence prior to 2001. And what I've done in that table is I've broken out it by the numbers of incidents, the killed, as well as those that are wounded. But don't worry about the numbers. I'm actually going to give you a different view in a second. If we could go to the next slide, and it's titled, All Political Violence in Pakistan. I want to draw your attention to this definition. A lot of data only focus upon terrorism. Terrorism is only one kind of political violence, and I'm going to walk you through the different kinds of violence that our data set shows. The first thing I'd like you to notice is you look across these maps, and I've given you 5 snapshots of specific years, and the different shadings that you're looking at are at the district level. The darker the number is, the more violence that district has experienced. So what I'd like you to notice when we look at all political violence in Pakistan is that there are some districts that generally recur. And these are districts that have a very strong propensity for violence. But equally important is that there are many districts that are largely violence-free. This is not a phenomenon that scholars have looked at very much, but part of the explanation is that some of those districts don't have a lot of people living in them. So there might be a very simple explanation. There's no one to blow up in those districts. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide focuses upon sectarian violence. And what we mean by sectarian violence, this is the violence where largely Deobandi groups, I think it's very important that we give them a name, Deobandi groups are targeting Shia. They also target Ahmadis. We're going to include in a different slide communal violence, which is violence against non-Muslims. But again, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that there are very specific districts that recur when we're talking about sectarian violence. It is not a phenomenon that exists all across the country. And indeed, there are many districts that have never experienced this at all. But not surprisingly, where we do see this, we generally see it in the Punjab. We see parts of Sindh lighting up. and we also see parts, particularly in the later years, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the Fata. If we could then go to the next slide. The next slide is very similar to sectarian violence, but this is focusing upon communal violence. And again, the perpetrators generally are the same. These tend to be Deobandi militant groups that are killing non-Muslims. And so this would include Hindus, and it would include Sikhs as well. On the next chart, the next slide, we present data on ethno-nationalist violence. Now, this, although when we talk about Balochistan, tends to take up a lot of media, again, what you see with respect to ethno-nationalist violence, it's very, very localized. Now, one thing I will say, there's likely to be a lot of underrepresentation in these data because coding for this is quite difficult. We could only call something ethno-nationalist if there was something in the event that caused us to do so. So this is likely to be very much underestimated. The next two slides are most important. If we could go to the next one. And this is called terrorist violence. And of course, many of the other kinds of violence I just talked about will be subsumed in here. The next two slides, the biggest distinction is the target. Terrorist violence, by definition, focuses upon killing non-combatants. So all of these folks saying that terrorists are now targeting non-combatants, those people are out to lunch, I don't know where they've been. Terrorists, by definition, target non-combatants, that's what they do. So the next slide, terrorist violence in Pakistan. Again, we see similar districts recurring across time, and we also see districts that are relatively free. So the idea that before 2001 Pakistan was free of terrorism is simply a canard that some people like to report. The next slide, though, is very, very different. The next slide focuses on what we are calling guerrilla violence. This is actually a new phenomenon in Pakistan, and thus the title of my talk. And you can see in the chart that I presented here where these things are happening. What I want to draw your attention to is a particular Pakistani story that Pakistan is a victim. And they will frequently cite the kinds of data that I'm presenting here to argue that they're victims of terrorists, not exporters of terrorism. Well, there's a really important story behind this chart that you're looking at. The most important perpetrator of this violence is the Tehreek-e-Taliban in Pakistan, or the TTP. What I really want you to understand is that there would be no Pakistan Taliban had there been no Afghan Taliban, had there been no Jaish-e-Mohammed, had there been no Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, had there been no Harkat-ul-Ansar, had there not been a Harkat-ul-Mujahideen, and a Harkat-ul-Jihad-e-Islami. These groups all have one thing in common. They are Deobandi. They share an architecture of madrasas and mosques. They have a political party, which is the JUI and its various factions that have given them cover, particularly when that political party was in power during the Musharraf regime in KPK, and it was partly, a partner in power in Balochistan. So what these different charts pull together is that Pakistan has certainly been a victim of terrorism for quite some time, but this new violence that has taken hold of the state, whereby these militant groups are attacking the ISI, the army, the frontier corps, the police, this is genuinely new. And there's no other word for it but blowback. This is very much, as folks in the terrorism literature like to say, the terrorist chickens coming home to roost. So the next slide, I think it will be too difficult to explain, but basically in the next slide what I've done is, since the previous maps give you snapshots by year, and they're constrained by that year, what the next slide does, and this is available on my website, I'm also happy to send these slides to anyone who wants them, this shows you trends in violence across time by the different provinces, including the Fata. And so what this allows you to see is within one province across time, what sort of violence is taking place. So I suspect, given the way you can see that picture in the room, that it might not be so apparent. All right, so now I've talked about what I'm going to call the supply of terrorism. That is to say, the different kinds of militant groups that are providing violence in Pakistan. And now I'm going to switch, and I'm going to talk about who is supporting violence in Pakistan. So in other words, what is the support base for the kinds of violence that we just observed in those different maps? So if we could have the next slide. The next slide simply describes the different sources where you can go to find these maps I'm going to show you. Again, email me, ccf33@georgetown.edu. Happy to send you the PowerPoint slides. On the next slide, what you should see, inshallah, are 4 maps. And these are called heat maps. And the darker, actually in this case, the darker blue means that there's less support for militants, in other words, opposition, and the redder the map is, the more support there is. So it's kind of intuitive. You're cool to the militants, or you're warm to them. In the upper left-hand chart, we show public support, again mapped out, for militants fighting in Afghanistan. In other words, the Afghan Taliban. This was the language that was used in the survey that we fielded. In the upper right, we have support for the so-called Kashmiri Tanzim. These are the groups largely killing Indians in India, but also in Punjab. It's a misnomer. Very few of the Kashmiri Tanzims are in fact Kashmiri. Most of them are in fact Punjabi, and they operate well beyond Kashmir. The lower left-hand corner is support for Al-Qaeda, droned upon Osama bin Laden. And then the lower right hand is for what's called Firqa Varana Tanzim. In other words, these sectarian groups. So what I'd like you to see, without focusing on any particular area, is that you have different support shown for these different groups. So in other words, Pakistanis are differentiating across these different kinds of groups in the levels of support that they show. But the one thing I do want to draw your attention to, in all of these maps, the place that has the greatest support for all of these groups is actually the Punjab. And that's the takeaway. When we're looking at support for militancy in Pakistan, the biggest bastion of support for this is coming from the Punjab. I'm happy to talk about why that is. It has a lot to do with partition and those narratives of violence. It has a lot to do with the co-location of militant groups with the military. So I'd like to remind you that the vast majority of Pakistan's military infrastructure is also in the Punjab. So this is not a situation of we don't have the power. This is definitely a situation of we don't have the will. Okay, so let's turn to the next slide. There's no maps here, so I'm going to walk you through it. There's a lot of conventional wisdoms out there about who supports terrorism and who doesn't. The most enduring story is that poor people support terrorism. And I'm here to tell you, I've done countless surveys on Pakistan with different kinds of colleagues using different sampling techniques, and we come to the same story. The poor people in Pakistan dislike these groups the most. The poor people who live in cities, in fact, dislike them most of all. And the reasons for that, and we have evidence to show this, is that they're the ones who are disproportionately affected by the violence. In contrast, we find most support for these groups coming from middle class and above, who are well educated. Now, this is a free rider problem, right? They're not experiencing the depravity of these militant groups. When these militant groups go into Lahore, they tend to attack, or Peshawar, they tend to attack in Sadr Bazaar, they tend to attack in places where people are not wealthy. In contrast, wealthier people have their servants, they're not doing the shopping themselves. So this is a classic free rider problem. So this idea that USAID or DFID can buy its way out of these problems is simply misinformed, because this is not being driven by poverty, it's being driven by actual preferences and choices. It's not compulsion. We'll just skip the next slide. The next slide is called Rebutting the Conventional Wisdom, Support for Democratic Values. So many of you know I had a president, he invaded some countries on the logic that if we just spread democracy, people will support terrorism less. So we did this, we took this to the lab in Pakistan, and it turns out that the people who are most supportive of democracy are actually those people who are most supportive of those groups operating in Kashmir and those groups operating in Afghanistan. And there's a simple reason for this. Those groups basically say that they're engaging in liberation, right? They say that they're engaging in liberation of oppressed people. And this appeal has a lot of resonance with people who are democracy supporters. So if you think going out there and spreading democracy is going to make people change their minds about terrorists, you have to think really hard about the message that these organizations are spreading and the degree to which people buy the story that these militant groups are supporting. The next couple of slides, and I'm going to go through these very quickly because you're going to see a whole bunch of numbers. And I don't want you, I'm going to walk you through what the numbers say in English as opposed to math. What we were next trying to do, we were trying to understand what are the individual characteristics that make people more intolerant relative to other people. And so we had 3 questions that we asked people. One was, do you want Christians as your neighbor? Do you want Shias as your neighbor? Do you want Ahmadis as your neighbor? And we looked at several variables that one traditionally includes in these kinds of models, but we were very much focusing upon education type, right? Because this whole madrasa debate versus other kinds of schools has been very much in the US public policy discourse as well as in the British discourse, and of course it's throughout Pakistan. I'm going to walk you through some of the key findings. And don't worry about the math that's on the next chart. I'm happy to share it with you. The first thing that's really important when we look across these measures of intolerance is that in most cases, but not all, those who attend a private school are more tolerant than those who did not. The only exception to that story is about Ahmadis. So Ahmadis are pretty much not wanted by neighbors by anyone. But for the other groups, private school attendance is associated with more tolerance. When we looked at who attended a madrasa controlling for all of these other things, we actually find that it's very significant in predicting intolerance towards Ahmadis, but it's irrelevant in predicting intolerance toward these other groups. What we also find, particularly with respect to Shia, is that those who say that they are adherent to the LA Hadith interpretive movement, as well as the Deobandi movement, they are less tolerant with respect to Shias. In contrast, we find all across, we find evidence that Barelvis tend to be more tolerant. That's sort of like the English breakdown in general of what this chart shows you. If we could go to the next graph, so the takeaway is schooling matters, but it doesn't matter in the same way across each kind of intolerance. So in other words, there's no silver bullet. Madrasa education predicts some kind of intolerance, but not all. Private schooling predicts some kinds of tolerance, but not all. So now let's turn to the next slide at looking at who supports Islamist violence. And here we are looking at public support for the TTP attacking Barelvis. We're looking at Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which is a group that attacks Shia. And we are also looking at support for the Pakistani government and its policy of negotiations and appeasement of the Pakistani Taliban. The next chart, again, it shows you a bunch of numbers, but let me walk you through what this actually means. In this case, we find that people who attend a madrasa are actually more likely to support both kinds of violence, and they're more likely to support the government's policies of negotiating and engaging in peace deals with the Taliban relative to those who did not. What we also find, incidentally, is that the people who are supporting Lashkar-e-Jhangvi are actually more likely to be individuals who have attained higher education. So this is an example of where we find those better educated people who, all else equal, have a higher taste for sectarian violence than those who have no education at all. We also find that adherence to the LA Hadith tradition supports or predicts support for TTP violence, as well as negotiating with the Taliban. And we also find evidence that those who adhere to the Dale Bundy group are similarly more intolerant and have a higher taste for violence than not. At the same time, we find that at least in the case of support for the TTP, those persons who are Barelvi are less likely to support those attacks. So in sort of bringing all of this together, what I'd like you to understand is that we have a lot of evidence that Pakistan has been the victim of many kinds of political incidences of political violence. But in many cases, this is not Pakistan for boo-boo, the world has done something terrible to you. This is not a Raw conspiracy or a Mossad conspiracy. This is actually the consequences of decades of Pakistan supporting Islamist militants. And one of the ways in which we see the imprimatur of these policies is the very deep support that these groups enjoy across the Punjab. And when we turn to different public policy approaches to manage this, we actually see that there is no silver bullet. Private education, public education, madrasas, they all produce different kinds of effects depending upon the kinds of questions. But the takeaway with respect to interventions that my government and your government has tried to do, which is development, education, employment, as well as support for democracy, we actually find evidence that just the opposite. It's the people who are educated, relatively well employed, relatively well off, who like democracy, who are most likely to support these groups. In contrast, the poor people in urban areas that are mostly the victims have very little support for these groups whatsoever. So thank you very much for tolerating a bunch of numbers from a talking head from a computer screen. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. It's a very interesting presentation. I've never seen that degree of authoritative detail about different groups and the attitudes that they display. I'm sure this will have generated a lot of questions. We have quite a short time, but yes.
My name is Mushtaq Bashari. Can I ask Dr. Christian Fair, was there any violence before 1977 in Pakistan, and who drove the society from a tolerant society, which I grew up in, to an intolerant society which we live in today?
Did you get that?
No, I didn't get it.
Was there any terrorism, extremism in Pakistan before 1977?
Was there any extremism and terrorism in Pakistan before 1977, is the question.
So, of course there was. I mean, we know from the 1950s there were massive anti-Ahmadi riots, and in fact the army had to be called out into the Punjab. We also know that there had been chronic unrest in the Sindh, NWFP, and Balochistan. So it's absolutely the case. But I'm interested in your timing of that particular year. Do you have a particular event? But no, I mean, Pakistan has experienced violence really, shuru se, you know, from the earliest years that the state came into existence.
My particular question was toward 5th of July 1977 when General Ziaul took over. Before that, there was no extremist element who killed Shia or Sunnis. It was only communal, which you mentioned in 1950. And second question was why the society from a very progressive liberal changed into an intolerant society which we live in today.
Did you hear that? The question relates to Ziaul Haq's accession to power as being the turning point.
I want to really put the nail in the coffin on this canard that Ziaul Haq did this. In my book, I go through all of the Pakistan military writings, really from the origins of the state. And despite the fact that Ayub Khan has the reputation of being a secularist, a womanizer, and a boozer, he actually began this. It was under Ayub Khan's tenure that he aligned Pakistan's school curriculum with the so-called ideology of Pakistan. And so it was actually during Ayyub's period that these preposterous narratives that Pakistan came into being when the first Muslim entered South Asia, and very gross and very crude and coarse narratives about religious minorities also came into Pakistan's textbooks at that time. It's really important to anyone who wants to understand this phenomenon that you stop trying to blame it on Zia al-Haq. This happened long before him. And in fact, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto took some of the most aggressive steps that brought Pakistan to the brink of this. It was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto who actually declared Ahmadis to be non-Muslims. And once you did that, you opened up the sluice gates for them to be killed with impunity. You're doing everyone a disservice if you continue this hoax that this somehow began with Zia al-Haq. This goes much farther back. And I'm actually going to argue, and I have argued elsewhere, that the origins of this intolerance begins with the two-nation theory itself. The very ideology of Pakistan is othering, that certain people can't live together, and that's nonsense. And the second thing that Pakistan did that put it on this trajectory of intolerance was the Objectives Resolution. And these things happened before Zia al-Haq could even imagine that he could have had the opportunity to run and ruin this country.
We have a lot of hands raised and very little time. I'm going to take 3 questions together and then put them to you. I'll try and summarize them if you can't hear them. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Tempuri Bar and I am a journalist from Prime TV. Christine, thank you sir, very much for this very enlightening presentation you've just given. My question is, we normally attribute this whole thing, this militancy in Pakistan, to the military policies, but I would also like you to throw some light on the civilian government and their role, because in 2007-2008, it was People's Party which gave this Nizam-e Adl to TDP in Sawat, Sufi Muhammad. Then we know that TMLN, the current ruling party, has been accused of harboring these elements within Punjab, which is their ruling base. And then recently, Pakistan, Tehreek-e-Insaf, the party ruled by Imran Khan, gave this.
Please, can you make your question short, because I'm not going to be able to relay all.
Give us some understanding of the role of civilians in this equation.
That question, the first question, Christine, is whether you have something to say about the role of civilian governments in stirring up communal violence as opposed to military. But just keep that for a moment. I'm going to take 2 more questions. Yes, please.
Hello, hello Christian, nice to see you. My name is Mehrab Sarju from London, associated with the Baluchi struggle for independence. The fundamental, that Syed...
Please, can you make your question short, because we really don't have time.
Syed Ramadan was a guest of Ayub Khan, who brought, he was a member of Brotherhood, who brought the fundamentalists to Pakistan, actually educated. He lived as a guest of the Pakistani state in Pakistan for 10 years. He's Syed Ramadan from the Muslim Brotherhood. He who created or helped to create the Jamaat Islami, what we know it today. What is a Christian faith?
In Balochistan?
I am from Balochistan, no.
But does your question refer to the...
Egypt. He's a brother, I think, son-in-law of Muhammad Abdu something like that.
I think the
guest of the Pakistani around the 1950 when Ayub Khan was...
I think the question is to what extent the Pakistan government contributed to the success or spread of the JUI in Balochistan.
No,
The Jamaat Islami.
Created, helped to reorganize by the Syed Ramadan, who was the author of the Islamic Conference, what we know it today, and the Islamic Bank as well.
I think you're going to have to put this question to Christina by email. It's too difficult to get across. Kiran.
But is it the Balochistan question that he's asking? Because I think I get it.
You think you get it? Well, just hang on for a moment. I can take 1 more question. Yes.
Hi, Christine. This is Dr. Baron Hassan from London. I'd rather say that I'm quite disappointed with your presentation today, because I've always been a huge fan of your initial presentations when you talk about the region. I mean, my broader concern is taking up some numbers, quoting some kind of quantitative data, and then making that particular analysis, which is, in my opinion, a little rather simplistic. Because if we have to look into Pakistan, the region in itself, I mean, look at Sri Lanka, look at Bangladesh, look at India, look at Pakistan. I mean, all these countries have had their own kind of like challenges vis-a-vis terrorism, vis-a-vis dealing with Facebook, possibly dealing with minority issues. So I would rather, I mean, I would expect a bit more sophisticated argument coming out of it. Do you see, is this an ongoing debate that you're going to be looking into?
Kiran Hassan is questioning whether using numbers is a too simplistic way of recording the intensity of communal violence and the like. And she's asking whether this is an ongoing research or whether this is, I mean, whether you likely to see sort of changes in the numbers which are going to explain something about it.
All right, so I'm going to turn to the civilian government because I'm really glad that this person asked this question. In the United States in particular, again, there's this myth that there's two Pakistans. There's the civilian Pakistan and there's the military Pakistan. And if one day the civilians could just truly be in charge, then Pakistan could be different. I argue in my book that that's unlikely because the strategic values of the Army, they've really done an effective job of smearing those values over into civil society. So when we do see prime ministers, it's hard to see whether their views are truly different from the military or whether they act like they acquiesce to the military because they're afraid of a coup. But here's what we can observe, right? We really don't have a true civilian leader until Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, right? We know this. And he was the worst, right? Under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in 1974, he began the Afghan Jihad. And there's a very long history. The Pakistani myth that the Americans sucked Pakistan into our jihad, it's really a myth. I can point you to loads of Pakistani sources on this. In 1974, we were really worried about Pakistan and India's nuclear proliferation. We didn't care about what was happening in Afghanistan. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, as I already mentioned, did some of the most pernicious things that turned the clock forward in terms of Pakistan's pervasive culture of intolerance. His daughter brought us the Taliban. She in fact brought all of her father's Taliban, well, they weren't Taliban at the time, but her father had a whole series of fellows, including Nasrullah Baba, who managed his Afghan policy and his jihad policy. So she brought all of these fellows back en suite, and she brought the Taliban. Though she herself is Shia, she went into political alliances with the anti-Shia SSP and the JUI, another anti-Shia political party, for no other purposes than cobbling together enough votes to be in power. And needless to say, her son continues to espouse this nonsense that Kashmir Pakistan banayega. And he says it in really bad Punjabi, which I think is kind of weird. And in fact, it was Zulfikar Bhutto